research program. So the R&D work stream has looked at research capacity on the continent, and currently the capacity as well as the sufficient and appropriate infrastructure is limited in many stages of the R&D process. There's good capacity in Africa for genomics and molecular epidemiology, including the identification of vaccine targets. And this has been clearly demonstrated by the efforts to track SARS-CoV-2 and detect emerging variants. There's some capacity for the construction of vaccines for preclinical testing in animals, but this needs substantial strengthening on the continent. What's quite interesting is that when we looked at who was doing vaccine work, there was 10 times more veterinary vaccine work being done on the continent for preclinical research compared to human vaccines. And this means that some of this expertise could be pivoted to human vaccines and also to feed into One Health type of technology. In order to move vaccines from preclinical research into clinical trials, the vaccines need to be manufactured according to current good manufacturing practice, or CGMP. And until now, there's been a lack of CGMP capacity, so that the few vaccines that have been designed in Africa had to be manufactured off-site for clinical trials. And this includes the candidate HIV vaccines that were developed in South Africa and funded by the South African AIDS Vaccine Initiative and the US NIH. And this program was eventually stopped due to a lack of government support, but also, importantly, a lack of a commercial partner. So this is now changing, with a number of initiatives on the continent planning to have pilot manufacturing facilities, including the messenger RNA transfer hub in Cape Town. If one looked at clinical trial capacity in Africa, this is far better coordinated than the preclinical vaccine, preclinical R&D ecosystem. The clinical trial, there are many countries that have good clinical trial capacity, and there are many clinical trials that have been coordinated across countries. Unfortunately, the vast majority of clinical trials in Africa test products from outside of Africa, and we're hoping with this initiative that we'll have products that are developed in Africa, manufactured in Africa, and the clinical trials are in Africa. So we've had very nice results from clinical trials in Africa. And most noteworthy were the COVID trials that have been done, Ebola. We've had really good TB results recently, malaria trials, a number of HIV trials that have not given the results we want, but continue to participate in the global effort to make an effective HIV vaccine. There's a need to boost funding infrastructure networks to enable R&D across the continent. And R&D will support the broader manufacturing goals as well as develop capacity and expertise to ensure pandemic readiness for future outbreaks. So the capacity challenges, the R&D capacity challenges can be identified by establishing a system of R&D centers. So our challenges are the lack of appropriate R&D infrastructure, the lack of existing networks and expertise. So while some networks exist within the clinical trials networks, we don't have the networks to enable people to understand how to take a vaccine from all the way from concept through manufacture to clinical trial. And we need to establish those networks and establish the expertise. The funding model is not directed towards Africa. So the majority of funding organizations don't see Africa as a place to fund preclinical research. They're quite happy to fund clinical trials for African diseases where we have a high burden of disease, and so it becomes a very efficient place to do clinical trials, but not necessarily to support the design of vaccines on the continent. And then a lot of training is done in Africa, but we don't have the jobs for people to stay. And so we have a huge brain drain of local talent. So 3 initiatives have been proposed. We want to set up a system of regional R&D centers that will be coordinated by PAVM. And so the first is to set up the regional R&D centers within each region to cluster the infrastructure and expertise. So expertise on a particular technology, value chain step, or vaccine. And to develop the R&D assets and infrastructure. So that we can see the whole value chain being supported in Africa. We want to have a coordinating platform to support information sharing and collaboration across the centers, and to develop partnerships, both local and international partnerships, and connect knowledge and expertise across the continent, and guide the continental R&D priorities and strategies. So the idea is that the coordinating platform will have representation from each of the regional R&D centers, and there'll be a harmonization of priorities across the coordinating platform feeding into the regional R&D centers. And then to implement a CGMP pilot manufacturing facility to meet the clinical trial need across the continent. These will depend on funding from other organizations, and we'll need to have a solid funding base. So the continental R&D coordinating platform will play a role in the fundraising, and will also manage the capability and capacity centers, which I'll be talking about, I think, after lunch. And these will feed into the R&D centers. The R&D centers will be a public-private collaboration between research centers, clinical research centers, biotechs, and government organizations. The idea is that they could be virtual, or they could be virtual platforms, or they could have physical co-locations, but there's no need to have everything in exactly the same place. So I think virtual relationships will be encouraged. They will be established across the Africa regions. There will not be one region that gets a center and others that won't. They will need to deliver meaningfully on at least one step of the R&D value chain. So there will be no need to have the whole value chain, but you would need to actually have the center being able to deliver on at least one step. And the centers will be granted based on the continental need to support the manufacturing ambition. So they're not going to be broad research centers. They're going to be centers that are targeted towards R&D to support manufacture of vaccines. So the centers could also be quite closely linked to the regulatory centers. And I think that each center should actually have a relationship with the regulatory centers, because the regulatory control of manufacture of vaccines is really important. And it's important that R&D incorporates all the regulatory requirements when they're doing R&D. The pilot manufacturing facilities can be set up as needed to support clinical trial requirements, but once again, there's no need for co-location. So it doesn't matter where on the continent the pilot plant is. The pilot plant can manufacture the vaccines, and the vaccines can be moved to the best clinical trial site to test for that particular vaccine. The idea is to have virtual relationships across countries and across the continent to enable the end-to-end value chain and to build capacity across the continent. And I think that it's also important to have international recognition, international collaborations, and to be part of the global initiative to facilitate vaccine manufacture and vaccine R&D. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce Professor Slim Karim, who's going to be moderating the roundtable discussion. Slim Karim is director of the Center for the AIDS Program of Research in South Africa, Durban, and I'm sure is well known to everyone. So I hand over to you, Slim.
Thank you very much, Professor Williamson. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you here this afternoon at what is today quite an important occasion, in that it provides us with an opportunity to highlight the challenges and the progress we're making in vaccine manufacturing on the continent. I'd like to thank Professor Williamson for her outline. She really gave us a quick and a very detailed overview about where things stand and how we need to be thinking about going forward. And of course, I know Professor Williamson for a few decades, and all her outstanding work on human papillomavirus. So I'm very pleased we have somebody of her caliber at the helm dealing with this. So this panel discussion is divided into two parts. My co-chair, Professor Mark Daibo, will be doing the second half of this session, and that is after the lunch break. Professor Daibo is very well known to all of us in Africa, having led PEPFAR over the years, and now currently he is Professor of Global Health at Georgetown University. But more about him later. Right now, we will be having a discussion with four eminent individuals who are comprise quite an impressive lineup. First on our list is Dr. Roger Glass, who I have known. Actually, I first met Roger back in 1987. Now that tells you how old we both are, actually, not just how old I am. Roger is really one of the world's preeminent scientists in the field of viral gastroenteritis, having done research on rotavirus, on Norwalk agent. And, when I met him, he was at that time chief of the viral gastroenteritis unit at the CDC. Now he has a global leadership role as head of the Fogarty International Center at the NIH. And the Fogarty Center is really the key organization that provides leadership and training and research across the world. And for those of you who don't know, Roger speaks 5 languages. And he's often found lecturing in all these different languages. I've found myself once or twice in the midst of a lecture being given by Roger in another language. So it's wonderful that we have somebody of his stature with us here today. The second member of our panel is Professor Pontiano Kalibu. Now, I won't even go into how long I know Pontiano, but he and I go back a long way. He is one of Africa's eminent scientists. Professor Kalibu is the director of the Uganda Virus Research Institute. And UVRI has been very well known for its work in HIV, and of course now has pivoted to dealing with COVID-19. UVRI hosts a WHO measles and rubella reference laboratory. And I think among the things Pontiano is probably well known internationally for was his initial work with IAVI in establishing a whole research program in Africa on HIV vaccine development. And he's a professor of immunovirology at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in the Department of Infection and Immunity. So we are blessed to have somebody of his caliber joining us as well. The next member of our panel is Professor William Ampofu. Professor Ampofu is an associate professor and the head of the virology department at the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research at the University of Ghana. And he's been involved in virological research over many years. He runs the National Influenza Center. He's been involved in genotyping and so on. He's served in many different capacities, including in many capacities in the WHO advisory groups on influenza. Professor Mpofu is currently the chair of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, and among his many other accolades is that he is the senior editor of the African Journal of Laboratory Medicine. So I'm indeed very honored that we have Professor Mpofu joining us today from Ghana. And then finally, our fourth member of our panel is Dr. Matthew Downham, who comes to us from CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And in fact, I was just recounting, I attended the first meeting that led to the creation of CEPI. It was held at the National Academy of Medicine offices in Washington. And there was this whole discussion between Wellcome Trust and Gates Foundation and NIH about how to prepare for future pandemics. And of course, now we are, right? Which is exactly what CEPI was set up for. And now, he's in the eye of the storm now, no longer just in preparing. And he is the sustainable manufacturing lead at CEPI. He's previously worked in Novartis vaccines and diagnostics, in AstraZeneca. He's worked on preclinical and early clinical development of vaccines and antibodies. He's previously chaired the Vaccines Europe Influenza Working Group. And now he concentrates his efforts through his work in CEPI on sustainable manufacturing. So I cannot think of a better group of eminent scientists that we have here today. So I'm going to kick us off, and I'm going to start with Professor Glass. Roger, would you like to share your thoughts about how can we in Africa tackle the whole challenge of the R&D value chain across the different stages, from all the way from product development, manufacturing, registration, distribution, and then to all of the clinical studies that are involved. How do you see Africa playing that role? And I want you to particularly give us a slant on how you think the international community can help us, particularly given your perspective coming from the Fogarty Center at the NIH. Over to you, Professor Glass. We need Professor Glass to be unmuted. Can Professor Glass be unmuted, please?
There we go. Great.
Here we are. Yes. Now we can hear you.
Slim, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm overwhelmed. I must say I'm delighted to be here at this meeting. And when I think about the goal of PAVM to have 60% of Africa's vaccines prepared or developed in the next 20 years, I think back of who will be doing this work. And the workforce that will be doing and succeeding with these activities are now going to be young people in their 20s and 30s, just finishing their PhDs or doctorals or somewhere in that early stage of their careers. And it is that group which will be absolutely essential for us to be able to accomplish the mission of PAVI, the capacity building for both research and for implementation of all of these strategies. Now that takes me back to our past experience with such a pandemic, the HIV pandemic. And at that time, Professor Karim was a young infectious disease doctor with absolutely minimal knowledge of HIV. And what did we do? At Fogarty, we started our first extramural training program, and we took young people from around Africa and the developing world, China, South America. We brought them into partnerships with American academic centers to learn about clinical research, to learn laboratory methods that were available in the late 80s when very few successes were known. We were still fighting to understand the virus. So that cohort began with HIV from the very beginning, when we had no drugs, no thoughts of vaccines, we weren't sure of prevention methods. We all had a lot to learn. And so it's that cohort that has now been so instrumental in bringing all these HIV drugs, prevention methods, and new activities that have made and brought HIV into a chronic disease, an incredible contribution. And it's that group of young people 20, 30 years ago who are the leaders, not only in HIV, but today in COVID. And I think the leadership in many countries that we see, we look to these HIV leaders who knew about laboratory science, clinical epidemiology, international partnerships, and could bring these resources to bear for leadership. There's a difference, though, with HIV and this pandemic. In this situation, and thinking about vaccines for Africa in the next 20 years, we know a lot about how to make vaccines in general. And if anything, COVID has taught us that there are multiple platforms that can work for vaccines. There are multiple changes that can be adopted, diagnostics. And of course, none of these are currently available in Africa. Importation of diagnostics, of drugs, of vaccines is all on the table. How do we deal with this, and how is this different from HIV? Well, in HIV, we had nothing to produce. We didn't have drugs, we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have diagnostics. It was in its infancy. Now we have those products available. So what we have to deal with is not only research for the next pandemic vaccines, and for some of the vaccines which are for diseases which are important in Africa, but for which there's no commercial interest in the North. Tuberculosis, schistosomiasis, cholera, typhoid, non-salmonella typhoidal disease. There are a whole string of these that the African CDC has outlined. So beyond just funding research in academic centers in the US, we have to fund a broader group of disciplines in bioengineering, in process design, in chemical engineering for liposomes, in the different platforms and adjuvants, in production, in maintenance of equipment. There's a whole field of engineering, of building business models to make business cases for these vaccines to be affordable, legal training for patents and intellectual property. There's a diversity of activities that will be needed, not only for the research, but for supporting this industry. And I think that's where we have to move next. Let me stop here for now and let the others speak, and we'll come back and discuss this further.
Thanks very much, Roger. I think you've given us a good platform, because one of the things I want to pick up on from what you said is that, you know, in any endeavor of such a grand magnitude, we're going to have to call on partnerships. So I'd like to call on Professor Kalibu. You know, you've been able to build partnerships. You lead the East African EDCTP network. You have been working with CROs, the private sector, the academic sector. How do you see, all those players coming together? What's the chemistry to make it all happen so that we build partnerships going forward?
Thank you very much. And indeed, partnership is the way we need to move forward. I think especially in Africa, as I've listened, we're beginning to develop, move forward into these areas of developing and participating in developing our own products, diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics. I think partnerships will be quite important. Partnerships within the academia, partnerships within the industry, and partnerships with the private and public sector, and partnerships within our communities is also important. So, and these partnerships are helping us in raising funds. The partnerships are helping us in building capacity. You have just listened to the very good program of Fogate that has really trained and has been a cornerstone, very important in our where we have been addressing our COVID, building from HIV. All our institutions are built on partnerships. It's very, very important. I'd like to touch also on the areas where we have been quite a little bit weak, the partnership with the private sector. I think the private sector, I've been at the forefront of the pandemic of COVID. And I saw when the pandemic was on how the private sector was really concerned because they were affected. They were affected by the COVID in terms of productivity. So they came to us, they were helping us to build testing and all that. And I feel now we have really moved, and private sector, even here in Africa, although it's very limited, is going to be more and more responsive. It's an area that where we need to move a little bit ahead. We have been very much behind in engaging the private sector because I can see we cannot move forward without only working with the public. A lot of our funding now for R&D and all that is coming from the public, especially international public, but also national public. So we need to bring in the private sector so that they can also make this contribution. With the pandemics, with the diseases that we have, the private sector will be affected. There are lots of reports that show you how much private sector has invested in the North, in the developed world, but in Africa, when you look at developing countries, you can see it's very, very, very low. So the question is not whether they're important, they're quite important. They play a very important role. It is how to engage them to bring them on. And I think now we have moved. The discussions we have had, I enjoyed the discussions of yesterday, bringing in all the manufacturing and rest that is coming into Africa by the private. I think that will be an incentive for more private to come and work in other areas where they have not been engaged, especially in research, basic research that will really develop the product. So that will be quite important. So partnership is very key, and we need to build on these partnerships if we want to move to move forward. And I think the start of the partnership on African vaccine manufacturing has been a good start. I've really liked the way this conference has been organized. I could see from yesterday, I really enjoyed bringing in everyone. And I think this has been a very good start to show our partnership. The conference, I think this is a very big, good, important stepping stone. So I hope I can convince you and say, we need to build on that. This is how some of us who have made a few successes, this is how we have moved and building these partnerships. And I think the next is really to bring in the area that I feel has been a little bit less, and especially in Africa, is the private. The private, we have a small private base, but I think even the small private, but also international private, needs to be brought in order to move forward our research and development agenda. Over.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalibo. I think you've been highlighting that fundamental push that we need. And in many ways, PAVM provides that opportunity to bridge, the sort of the guiding philosophy of academia, which is to do good, to make discoveries, and the guiding philosophy of business, which is let's make money, and bringing those two together, to create, because there's no way PAVM is going to be an academic only exercise. It's fundamentally has to be a partnership with the private sector. And I think the way you articulated it has really provided us with a good way to think about going forward. So let me bring Professor Mpofu in at this stage. Professor Mpofu, share with us, some of your thoughts. If we're going to create these partnerships, and we're going to build this excellence to manufacture vaccines. I think we heard Professor Williamson gave us marching orders, right? We got what she said, 1.4 to 1.7 billion doses we're going to have to make. So if we're going to do that, one way in which we've been thinking about that is about creating regional R&D centers and creating, platforms to enable this to be done. Share with us, your thoughts. How might we be in a better position to use regional strengths, build partnerships to take this agenda forward across the multiple stakeholders? Your thoughts, Professor Mpofu.
Yes, Salim, thank you very much. One little correction. I'm now retired as the head of virology. So I'm assisting the university on a contract basis. And it's actually a great pleasure, for the work that we've done in advocacy with the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative over the years, and we're very glad that this conference is taking place and bringing us all together. So the first thought that comes to mind is exactly what was described in the previous session, where we heard about how the mRNA, hubs have been established, wonderful work that has been done in South Africa, with support from WHO and other partners. So the partnership has been critical to utilizing the existing knowledge and capacity on the continent, but it also has to be, tailored with reality, about the basic infrastructure, water, power, and of course, the human resource. So I would think that the examples we've heard about the potential and the good progress made with the mRNA hub establishment, especially from South Africa, is the way to go. And of course, this has been possible because of the tremendous will. The urgency of the COVID pandemic has fueled the aspirations that we've had for some time. And I think that looking at academia as one significant resource to build upon is very key. I recall in the establishment of the Africa CDC strategic framework, the identification of centers of excellence in the different parts of Africa, and how these targeted national institutes served as the pillars on which Africa CDC would work with disease prevention. I think it's coming to bear, as you have articulated, on starting vaccine manufacturing. So we do know, where the centers of excellence are, and then as a previous speaker said in the beginning, the young people who are 20, 30, 40, 35 in their, starting their scientific careers will serve as the critical human resource, to build these hubs. And so the work that was outlined in the beginning, showing the identification of the potential diseases, the kind of tech transfer that would be required, and a strategic framework will enable these regional hubs to move forward. And indeed, the clinical trials on HIV, and the work on respiratory viruses have provided a strong, fulcrum and foundation for us in Africa. I think we can build on all these and use, of course, the tragedy of Ebola that we continue to experience, and see how these can work in synergy towards helping establish these regional hubs. I mean, back home in Ghana, this is something that we are trying to push forward. We're having very strong partnerships, again, discussions with colleagues in Oxford to look at setting up, using our academic structures, looking at the KEMRI. We have a very good partnership with Institute Pasteur. So all these are, I think, to bear in a very positive, situation right now. And with this framework outlined by the PAVM, I think we're really making significant progress towards establishing these regional hubs. It will not be easy. One difficulty will be bringing our people back when we train them. I think one good strategy is to train them locally and in partnership with industry, let them see the opportunities that are available and then we will be able to keep them and avoid brain drain as we move these things forward. So those are my initial thoughts, Nim, and I think we're having a very positive discussion that will serve as a good foundation to take us forward for vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Over.
Wonderful, Professor Mpofu. I like the way in which you brought together, giving real examples of how we are translating these concepts into actual practical activity. I want to go next to Dr. Downham. And, so we've talked about, the need to cover the value chain to ensure, we're building capacity, we're drawing on the young people, we're building partnerships, and we're trying to bring in all of the key players at a regional level to create these centers that can really move us forward. Now, as you think about this, and from your bird's eye view from CEPI, how do we work at from regional level with global players, international players, scaling up that R&D capacity? What is it going to take to do that, especially if we want to give, Africa a real boost in this area? How can you see that happening? And give us your perspective from CEPI. Dr. Downham.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Karim. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm grateful for your kind introduction a little earlier, and to the conference organisers for this opportunity to sit on this panel. As we've heard already from previous speakers, the word partnership features very frequently, and it's all about how to build those partnerships, not just within Africa, but externally to Africa as well. So there is a key requirement, as I think is broadly recognised, to establish or expand vaccine manufacturing capacity and capability throughout the continent. And it will require this internal and external continental collaboration and engagement to really truly deliver. There's a critical component here regarding the interconnectedness to ensure that end-to-end vaccine supply chain is maintained and sustainable moving forwards. A little earlier this year, CEPI conducted a survey to map the vaccine landscape of manufacturing capacity and capabilities across a number of global regions, including Africa. And what we've identified there is not only the landscape of what exists, but where the aspiration to develop and move forward exists as well. So in terms of aspiration, there's the funding element, there's the local government support, there's also the tech transfer, and there's been some discussions on that already today. And it's how to facilitate that moving forwards. So in terms of how to coordinate and work with the international global organizations, what we've done as a consequence of the survey is institute a couple of workshops to firstly review the study data that CEPI has gathered, identify the gaps and opportunities, and really try to brainstorm on the activities required to develop roadmaps to establish vaccine manufacturing to increase that scale locally within Africa. And there's a couple of key requirements needed here. And we've heard some of those already from the partnership perspective. But fundamentally also it's required a champion, someone to provide that oversight, that leadership to deliver the objectives in country and region. But it's not just sufficient to have a champion, you need local ownership as well. Boots on the ground, people within country, within region, to really grasp the flag and move forward in terms of how to institute vaccine manufacturing capacity, scale up within that kind of region. And also the support, and we're going to talk about this a bit later as well, in terms of talent and work skill, upskilling as it were. In other words, the training, the education component, and so on. So there's a local ownership, there's the need for business potential, models, etc. There's a need for sustainability, and there's a need to expand that infrastructure. So there's the training needs, the regulatory infrastructure, the public-private collaborations and partnerships. So these are the kind of components that are needed to support scale up of local research and development capacity moving forwards, and training is going to be a key one coming up later. This gives me a little opportunity actually to reference as well CEPI's very close engagement with this activity. And what CEPI has done very recently is reissued a call for proposal to expand its centralized laboratory networks. And this is a network established to measure immune responses that have been elicited by vaccine candidates. And I'd like to strongly encourage African laboratory facilities to visit CEPI's website and look at the corporate proposal and hopefully apply. Because what we're trying to do is establish a laboratory network that will support research and development infrastructure build from that perspective to support vaccine monitoring and analysis moving forwards. There's going to be more discussion as well as a share further other activities coming up in the new year, but I just wanted to respond to your question and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Downham. So, you mentioned this whole issue of sustainability. I have to say it's a big worry of mine. We're talking about huge investments, not just in physical infrastructure, but in huge investments in human capital infrastructure, because we're going to have to create a whole generation of technicians, scientists, and so on to do this. So sustainability is going to be a key factor. So Professor Kalibu, how are we going to create that sustainability? How are we going to get our own African governments to take ownership and to ensure the long-term sustainability, especially during the fallow period, when the sale of products will be at a how do we ensure that we can create that continuity and get our local governments to be part and parcel of this? Share your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think that's a very important area that has been bothering all of us, sustainability. To tell you the truth, a lot of what we're doing in Africa, many institutions that I know of that are contributing to research and development, and what is coming in is international. A lot of it is international funding, either through some particular cooperative arrangements or applying for competitive grants or working, collaborating with some bigger pharmaceuticals and all that. But for sustainability, you bring in the African governments. They need to come in, they need to come in. And we have been talking about this for a long time, meeting all the pledges African governments have put into what percentage of GDP, 1% into research and development for sustainability. We cannot talk about sustainability if the governments and the public does not come in. And I'm very pleased that now Africa CDC, very close to African Union now, I think they are very, very close, and they have knocked on the doors and they can see the doors beginning to open. I can see a lot of things we have done for a long time. COVID has given us an opportunity to open up. Many governments are now really saying, what can we do? How can we get involved? Everyone is rushing in. I hope these gestures will lead to funding so that we can have proper funding, proper accountability, openness so that there's transparency in the way we do things, there's access to funding, there's access to training, capacity development, there's access, and also start talking about markets and all that so that we can attract, because we need to attract, just as Dr. Downingham has said, we need to attract more the international to come into Africa to building. Again, it will be partnership in sustainability, but we need really the governments, the public to come in to know what is good. Because, some of these diseases are for Africa, as he has already been mentioned. They're diseases for us. They're not diseases for others. So we need to find a way of how can we sustain and how can we be able to really address our epidemic. I think we need to be ahead, then we can attract others. So public funding will be very important, and we need to support organizations like Africa CDC and the Partnership for African Vaccine. I think there's a way that is going to really accelerate and stimulate our African government so that we can have sustainability. The other one is, of course, training, building, capacity building. Very, very important, because we need finances, we need the institutions, strong institutions with strong leadership that will move the research agenda forward, and of course the training, the capacity building. And there we shall talk later about talent, so that we can have talent that can be retained in Africa, and they can see a future of building their career into science and research and development. So I think all of this we need, but we need really funding, African government to come in, and the right environment. the regulatory environment, which is also important, that we have been talking about the past 2 days. So that's how I can see we can move forward. Thank you. You're muted, Slim.
Sorry, my apologies. Yes, you've touched on many key challenges, Pontiano. I want to just touch on one of the issues you raised, because in many ways, if we're going to build this capacity in Africa, it's got to have, as a long-term vision, a self-sustainability model. In other words, we make a product, we sell it, and the business end of it becomes sustainable because there are enough buyers out there to buy your product. Now, given that's the long-term goal, in the interim, there has to be a lot of investment, support, continual investing in order to get to that point of sustainability. And my worry is that part of all of this has to be that we've got, as African scientists, we've got to create that vision. We've got to create that vision through our leadership. Now, we're very fortunate today in having Dr. Glass, who has played a key role in supporting, facilitating, cajoling even many great leaders in medical research in Africa. Dr. Glass, you want to just share with us some of your thoughts? What is it going to take? How can we continue to foster the kinds of leadership that are going to build that vision, create these regional structures, create this capacity with an approach of doing, being academically excellent, but also moving towards self-sustainability? But that leadership, share your thoughts, please.
Yeah, Slim, that's a great question. And about 3 years ago, we hosted a meeting in Africa where we brought together African leaders and we said, NIH, the Wellcome Trust, Gates, we've all been funding as much as we can in Africa. There's great creativity here. HIV solutions have all been developed. What more can we do to get greater government involvement, private sector involvement, philanthropy involvement, the African Development Bank's involvement? What more can we do? And we sat our African leaders in a room with some business people from Africa. And after a few hours, they came back and said, and one of the great academics came and said, Roger, NIH has been investing in all of us as researchers, and we are terrific researchers now. We can publish papers, we get advancements in our academic careers. But what we don't do is develop products, diagnostics, vaccines. We develop knowledge. And they said, what we really need, we have to change the paradigm. This was before COVID. And they said, look at Kendall Square. You have right next to the big academic universities, you have engineering sites, you have biotech startups, you have programs that bring together health scientists, engineers, business folks, biodesign. And instead of publishing a paper after your master's in bioengineering, you get a startup. And that startup is a business that is led to a Shark Tank investors, and it's economically productive. If we had that kind of training, we could get our ministers of finance involved in those activities which lead to economic developments and businesses, as opposed to research, which just leads to development of knowledge that we can't capitalize on. I thought that was very telling. And for 3 years, without the pandemic, we were wrestling with how we could get this energy into the sector. The pandemic has done better than anything we could have imagined. It has shaken trees to let every government in Africa and around the world recognize that this pandemic has directly affected their economic productivity. Every sector of society is affected. This is an issue of biosecurity, but it's also the well-being of the country. We have failed to invest in developing all of these products that we now have to import. So I see a change in the way we train people. I see a change in that we're not only need to, and especially with COVID, where we have drugs, we have diagnostics, as a starting point to say, let's develop a diagnostic industry around everyone's being screened for COVID. How about screening for other infectious diseases when this is over? How about the business models of startups that not only provide for vaccines, but provide for the supply chain for vaccines? You know, that Pfizer vaccine requires 170 or so different components. And if you miss them or you can't find them locally, you're going to be stuck. How about basic things for biotech and survival of human beings like oxygen and low-cost ventilators? How about frugal innovation? This is great for those partnerships, both for the US and the Africans. And when I come here and I see in Kenya how banking is done by cell phones, leapfrog, frugal technology. When I'm here in Rwanda, where the Zipline program was developed, partnership between young people in California and President Kagame to deliver drugs and life-saving blood supplies to women hemorrhaging, delivered by drones, pioneered here, and now we're using drones in Baltimore to deliver organ for transplant across the city. Reverse innovation. We all have things to learn from this. So I think as we think about capacity building, we can't just train people in the research environment. We have to train them for the total system, because in the US, our biotech industry is one of the richest and most rapidly growing. This could happen in Africa as well. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glass. I mean, it's quite telling that, across the world, we see countries, in some instances, they focus on IT technology. In other instances, they develop biotechnology. And essentially, they create these hubs, and you get all these little startups, one or two people companies that just have great ideas and are trying to move them forward. Now, we just haven't been able to leverage, our talent, our investments into these kinds of startups, because, whatever platform we're building, it's not just about the manufacturing, it's also got to be about the R&D. It's got to be that you create pipelines so that you have products coming down the line. So, that the way you describe the importance of that whole process for me was critical. So let me get, Dr. Downham to talk about, we have a real challenge in not supporting or creating an exciting environment, like Kendall Square. I mean, I have to say, I get envious when I go to Boston and I see, per square meter, they probably have more, biotechnology experts than, almost anywhere else I know. Now, how are we going to do that in our regional centers? How are we going to create these R&D coordinating platforms that support these kinds of biotechs? Share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Karim. And that's really a very important question, because it's the building block, the start for future research and development and vaccine manufacturing moving forwards. Certainly, to your point, what CEPI is really thinking about is how to establish development and manufacturing facilities to support improving global epidemic or pandemic preparedness and response. And this really builds on how CEPI was originally founded, based off the Ebola crisis from 2017, 2016, to really focus on key diseases that impact particularly low middle income countries, priority pathogens, the kind of pathogens that are circulating continually, that facilities could be established to address and provide vaccines for locally, for local administration. So with that in mind, CEPI has been building on its kind of ongoing investment. It hasn't deprioritized due to COVID. It's continued with its work on Lassa, the Lassa vaccine program, which we were the first to institute a clinical trial for phase 1 for, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya. I've chosen just 3 pathogens there that are specific to Africa, but there's others as well. And it's to continue that support, but facilitate support within Africa to transition the knowledge, upskill workforce, and build that research and development capacity moving forwards. So there's a number of funding aspects that to consider there as well, that the African Union CDC is engaged with, and CEPI is also supporting. One thing I was also going to mention as well is that the network I mentioned a moment ago is going to be launched. We're going to institute an expression of interest in the new year to identify these networks and start supporting them to transition candidate vaccine development, manufacture, and innovative solutions. So what innovations are going to be needed in Africa in future to meet the kind of demands for supporting vaccine administration, maybe in the field, in remote areas, in challenging geographies, some of the drier areas or the tropical jungles, let's say. There's a need to be able to meet the demands of the terrain, to reach the people in those terrains. Such things as the thermostability of vaccines, how do we facilitate that? If you really think what Dr. Tedros's view, we're not all protected until everyone is vaccinated. That means you need to get to the rural communities, the communities that are remote, for which you need specific innovations and capabilities for vaccines. So CEPI is really focusing on those, and we'll be thinking more about those, issuing expressions of interest in the new year to help countries and regions in Africa meet those demands.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donald. Well, our time is up. Can you believe it? I mean, I feel like we're just getting going, and we've got so much more to talk about. We've just scratched the surface, but we've raised so many important issues. And so when I think about, when you look back at December of last year, there were 5 countries that had a head start in vaccinating. And those 5 countries, the US, UK, Germany, China, and Russia, all were making their own vaccines. Some of them already vaccinating, their military before the vaccines were even approved. And so we saw, in many ways, COVID-19 was a wake-up call that if you manufactured vaccines, if you made your own vaccines, you didn't have to join the end of the queue. You didn't have to stand with a begging bowl and say, "Can I have vaccines, please, sir?" No, we should be, and rightfully should have vaccines at the same time as everyone else. And that means we've got to make them ourselves. And so we have a challenge that we have to rise to. It's a challenge we cannot afford to fail in. But that challenge is going to need us understanding the full extent of the value chain, all of the pieces of the puzzle, how we're going to implement all of those, who are the partners we're going to bring, how we're going to mobilize regional capacities, how we're going to build sustainability, how we're going to get local buy-in and investment, because ultimately we want to create that leadership, and that leadership will give us that entry point to building a sustainable future in vaccine manufacturing. On that note, I'd like to thank all of my members. I would be amiss if I did not comment that I am not a supporter of manels, and unfortunately today we had a manel, and it had slipped me because I wouldn't normally participate in manels. So I want to apologize to everybody for my error in not identifying that we are an all-male panel. Manels, for those of you not familiar with the terminology, people like Francis Collins, myself, and many others have publicly stated we will not participate in manels. So this is a message I'm ending off with Africa CDC. Please make sure you don't have manels. I'm just allowing this one because Annalise Williamson was with us, even though she wasn't in our panel discussion. So on that note, I want to thank all of my wonderful panel members. I count many of them among my good friends, and colleagues. And so it's been terrific to have this discussion with you. I hope that all of you out there, really enjoyed the occasion, found the stimulating discussion points, and have will go away, just that little bit richer for having participated and heard this discussion. And if we've any way have contributed to that, we've done a good service for the day. Thank you very much to all of you. We now break for lunchtime, and you'll come back to Mark Daibo and let me say a big thank you. I'm not sure if somebody else is going to say anything, but we are meant to come back after lunch at 1:25. So that's I've been a really naughty boy. I've gone about 3 minutes over my time limit, but I'm hoping that you will still have enough time for lunch, and lunch you come back. That would be at 1:25. So on that note, I wish you all a good lunch and see you back here at 1:25. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Karim. Bye-bye, everyone.
I want to thank Dr. Salim. Great to see you, Doctor. And yes, we will make sure that we no longer have minnows in our program. As you just mentioned, this is the first part of this conversation around building R&D and talent, a pool of talent across the continent. And we'll be back here, as you just mentioned, at 1:25. So it's a short lunch break. And we'll come back with Professor Williamson, who will talk to us a little bit more about the regional capacity and the regional capacity centers, with the understanding that several components have to come together and there's need to mobilize regional capabilities. Conversations are helping us dig deeper into ways to leverage what's in place and build for what's not in place. So to those online, let's be back at 1:25 sharp. To those in the room, we have ushers that will lead us out of the room. I think lunch is in the ballroom, just like we had yesterday for day one. And yeah, for joining, and we'll be back in this room shortly. Thank you.